Great, looks like folks can hear us. That's great. So maybe we'll just wait one more minute for folks to join us and then we can go ahead and get started. We're really excited that folks are here for our first ever webinar.
So it looks like we have Harvey and Isabel with their dad, and also we have Kelly and her kiddos.
Great. Hi, Harvey and Isabel. Hi, Harvey and Isabel's dad. Hi, Zoe. All right, should we go ahead and get started, Emily? What do you think?
It looks like we have about 12 people watching. We also have James and Robbie watching.
What were their names?
James and Robbie.
James and Robbie. Hi, James and Robbie.
Let's give it one more minute. I'm going to invite or accept some invitations to the Facebook group so these people can view. And then once they're all signed on, I would say we can get started. Let's get started at 11:05.
Okay, perfect. That sounds great. It looks like we have our coworker Jesse on, who's also super excited to learn about space and his cool spacesuit. He came prepared today. All right, what do you think, Emily? Should we get started?
Yes, we have 12 people watching, and it looks like we can probably get started.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone to our first ever part of our webinar series, which is going to be called Think Outside the Box. So we plan on having one of these every month, so definitely be on the lookout on the group for us to have more of these coming up. We'll be kind of showing what our next month's topic is going to be pretty soon here, so be on the lookout for that. But we're super excited that you're here today and joining us today for our first ever one. So we're really excited, and we're really excited to be partnering with NASA and the Artemis team for this webinar. And our speaker, I'm super excited to have a wonderful engineer named Caitlyn, and I'm going to kind of read a quick bio so you guys have some background on her, and then we're going to have Caitlyn do a brief presentation, and we'll follow that up with a Q&A afterwards. And so Emily will be the one doing our Q&A. So definitely during the presentation or while Caitlyn's talking, if you have questions, definitely feel free to add those questions in the chat. No questions are too simple or too complicated. We also have another NASA employee on the line too. So if Caitlyn doesn't know the answer to something, hopefully Patricia, our other NASA friend, will have the answer. So definitely add any questions you have in the chat. So I'll go ahead and read Caitlyn's bio. So Caitlyn Durham has worked for NASA at the Marshall Space Flight Center for 10 years. She earned a bachelor's degree in aerospace engineering from West Virginia University and a master's degree in aerospace engineering from the University of Colorado Boulder. Caitlyn currently works as a systems engineer for the solid rocket booster element of NASA's Space Center launch system. In that capacity, she is responsible for operational requirements, launch commit criteria, flight instrumentation, and a variety of other things. Throughout her career at NASA, she has also worked on math models, virtual reality, small-scale launch vehicles, rocket equation tools, International Space Station payloads, rocket engine turboprops, and guidance calculations. I believe that's it. So welcome, Caitlyn. We're so excited to have you, and I'll kind of turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you guys so much for having me. This is exciting and also a little bit different to be doing this kind of talk via webinar. But so I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do at NASA and what we're doing on SLS, and just kind of what our plan is. And then, of course, I'll answer any questions. So I'm going to go ahead to my presentation. Like you said in the introduction, I'm Caitlyn Durham. I'm an aerospace engineer for the Space Launch System. I'm going to talk a little bit about our program and what we're doing. So first of all, because this is kind of a top, maybe a wider variety of people listening to this, a wide audience, I want to just talk a little bit about NASA really quick and where we're located. So we have 10 field centers across the country, and you can kind of see those here. And then just to give you guys a little bit of perspective, I work at the Marshall Space Flight Center, which is in Huntsville, Alabama. You guys are probably most familiar with the Johnson Space Center, which is in Houston. And then I just added a little thinkery thing on here so you guys would kind of get an idea of where you are in relation to NASA and where we are. So let's just talk a little bit about what we do. So first of all, right now we have the International Space Station, which is currently orbiting the Earth in what we call low Earth orbit, which is kind of this very thin circle around the Earth, almost like if you put a rubber band around an apple, that rubber band would represent low Earth orbit and the apple would represent the Earth. So low Earth orbit's really close to the Earth, and we think about space as being far away, but in terms of how big space actually is, low Earth orbit's really close. And so what we say for low Earth orbit here is that that's between 99 and 1,200 miles above the surface of the Earth. So, and then, like I said, we have the space station that's in low Earth orbit now. We send astronauts up there, and we've had astronauts living at the space station continuously since I think 2000. Patricia maybe can correct me on the year. But the space station is actually really big. It's larger than a 6-bedroom house and weighs almost 1 million pounds. And it is, it's 357 feet end to end, which is about the size of a football field. So the whole area that the space station covers is about a football field. There's 8 miles of wire connecting all of the electrical power systems within the space station. And it's also got this really cool robotic arm that is called the Canada arm. It was provided to us by the Canadian Space Station, or provided to the, not provided to us, but provided to the ISS. And it can move things around and lift stuff, and it can lift 220 pounds. So that's really, it's kind of the Canada arm's a really neat part of the space station. So that's what low Earth orbit is. The focus for me is really on beyond Earth orbit, and what that means is the things past where the space station is. So the moon, Mars, everything else in our solar system and beyond is all in this beyond Earth orbit. The moon is at 238,000 miles away. We've gone a little bit farther just from like orbiting the moon, but that's as far as we have gone so far. So let's talk about the moon. Like I said, the moon's about 239,000 miles away from Earth. That distance is 9.5 times around the Earth. So if you ran around the Earth 9.5 times, then you will have run the distance that it would take to get to the moon. Our planet is not the only planet with moons in the solar system. And our moon isn't even the biggest moon in our solar system. So there are 4 other moons bigger than our moon, and then a whole bunch more smaller moons. The moon, we kind of think of as not having an atmosphere, but it actually really does. But it's a very thin and weak atmosphere, and it's not something that humans, it doesn't provide enough oxygen for humans to breathe in. So effectively no atmosphere, but there is a small atmosphere that's called the exosphere. You guys may have heard of lunar eclipses. A couple of years ago, in 2017, we had a full solar eclipse. Is that right? Yes. Where the sun passes in front of the moon. I'm sorry, the moon passes in front of the sun and blocks out the light from the sun. The same thing can happen where the moon is directly behind the sun, and so that would be a lunar eclipse. No, I said that wrong. The moon and the sun are on opposite sides of the Earth, sorry. The space geometry is complicated sometimes. Anyways, so let's see. Oh, the moon is actually, so the moon doesn't have soil. It has something that we call regolith, which is like this, it's almost like gravel dust. It's like dusty rock stuff, and we call it regolith. It's not made of cheese. I like that. It's fun to think about the moon being made of cheese, but unfortunately it's not. The regolith is really interesting, though, to study, because it doesn't really, it's different than a lot of things we have here on Earth. It's very abrasive. It gives us a lot of engineering challenges working with the regolith. So also, so we have we've taken 12 people to the moon so far. All of those were American astronauts. The first one, Neil Armstrong, he walked on the moon on July 20th, 1969. So that's 51 years ago. 51 years ago. Just a couple of days ago. So that was really, that wasn't a huge accomplishment for us at NASA and also just for humanity, right? So we've done that 12 times. We've taken 12 different people up there. It takes those astronauts about 3 days to get from the Earth to the moon. We launch them into space, and then that travel time between Earth and the moon is 3 days. So the Artemis program that we've talked about, that you've heard mentioned a couple of times, is our current program to take people back to the moon. And so we're working on those plans to land people on the moon again in 2024. So, okay, Patricia, this is my We Go charts. So let me stop sharing.
"50 years ago, we went to the moon. We called it Apollo.
What many people don't know is that Apollo had a twin.
She was a woman named Artemis, goddess of the moon.
We are returning to the moon.
As a new generation of explorers, this time to stay.
And to prepare to achieve humanity's next giant leap of sending the first human missions to Mars.
We believe our course will redefine what is possible.
That we would discover life-saving,
Earth-changing science.
and that the challenges ahead will inspire generations.
This is our manifest.
For all who wonder if we could return.
For all who dreamed of pressing beyond.
This is your calling. We go for all of America.
We go. We go as the Artemis generation.
We go.
That video gives me goosebumps every time I watch it. So, okay, I'm going to get back to my presentation. Okay, so how are we going? What we're doing is we're building a new rocket that's called Space Launch System. So I work on the Space Launch System team. We have kind of two varieties of a Space Launch System. We have a crew variety, so that would be the rocket that's responsible for launching the astronauts, and then we have a cargo variety, and that would be the rocket that's responsible for bringing up the different kind of pieces of equipment that we need to help us land on the moon. So both the crew and the cargo version of SLS have a core stage. And so that's the big orange part. And what that is it's mostly just fuel tanks. It takes a lot of fuel to leave Earth, to overcome Earth's gravity, especially when you have to lift something that big. And so basically everything in the orange tanks that you see is just fuel. So then we also have 2 boosters, and so those are the kind of crayon-like things on the side of the rocket, and those are solid rockets, which means they're made of a solid propellant. It's kind of the consistency of a pencil eraser, and you light it like a candle, and it just burns as soon as you light it, and so that helps us get off of Earth, because it really takes a lot to get off of Earth. So once those burn out, we throw them away, and then the rest of the vehicle can keep going. After we have used all the fuel from the core stage, then we have an upper stage. And so the upper stage, once you're kind of almost to the orbit, but you're not quite there, the upper stage just gives you that final kick that you need to get all the way into orbit around the Earth. So then the crew variety has the Orion Capsule, which is the capsule that the astronauts will ride in, and it has a launch abort system. The launch abort system is there to help us in the event of an emergency to get our astronauts away safely. So if we know something's going wrong and we don't know if we're going to be able to protect our astronauts, the launch abort system will basically, it's another small rocket on top of our big rocket that just pulls the Orion capsule away from the rest of the vehicle to get them kind of at a safe distance in case something happens. And then that cargo just has the payload fairing there, and that's basically just a shell that goes around whatever it is that we are launching to space. And then once we get to space, that payload fairing will break away, and then the payload will be in space. So that's kind of the basics of what the rocket looks like. Oh, I forgot to mention all that fuel in the orange tanks. We use that fuel with 4 engines called RS-25 engines that are at the very bottom, and they're tiny little things down here at the bottom. And those burn all the fuel that's in the orange tank. Okay, so how much weight can SLS carry? I was talking earlier about how when you lift stuff, you have to have a lot of fuel to do all that lifting. So previously on the space shuttle, we could lift 65,000 pounds, which is the equivalent of carrying 5 NFL teams. So if you like collected the Dallas Cowboys or the Houston whatever, I don't know, you collect those teams 5 times, then you could lift all of them with the space shuttle. So then the SLS, the crew variety, can lift 12 NFL teams. So multiply all their weight times 12, and that's what the SLS crew variety could launch. The Saturn V is the vehicle that we used when we went to the moon 50 years ago. And so at that time, we just used 1 rocket to launch both the equipment that we needed and the crew. So the Saturn V could launch 260,000 pounds, which is 20 NFL teams worth of weight. Then our SLS cargo variety, which is the thing that will launch our equipment, since we're doing this kind of as 2 launches instead of 1, it can launch 22 NFL teams worth of weight, which is a lot. And honestly, even I have a hard time wrapping my brain around the idea of like, how much does 22 NFL teams even weigh? Like, it's a lot. So, all right, let's talk about speed. So Usain Bolt can run 28 miles an hour, which is like really fast. He's the fastest human on the planet, right? But ostriches can run 60 miles an hour, which is way faster than Usain Bolt can run. But cheetahs can run 70 miles an hour, which is faster even than Usain Bolt and ostriches. But then what about machines? Well, NASCAR cars can, they can reach top speeds of 200 miles an hour, which is really fast, right? If you see one of those go by, crazy fast, right? But the SLS, it can go 22,600 miles an hour, which is, again, another number that's almost impossible to even comprehend what 22,600 miles an hour is, even when you compare it to the 200 miles an hour that a race car can go. So point is, really fast. But what does that mean? Oh, I guess I left out a chart. But that speed is required to get us to orbit, because in order to get to orbit, you have to go really fast to get away from the Earth's gravity, right? And that speed is what's required to get up into the Earth's gravity, so that's why you have to go 22,600 miles an hour. All right. The Orion spacecraft, I told you before, is the capsule that the astronauts will ride in on their way to the moon. First, you just have the kind of crew module, which is just the capsule itself. That's number 2 on the image. One is the launch abort system that I talked about earlier that pulls the astronauts away when there is a danger or something that they need we need to help them get to safety in the event of an emergency. And then the third, number 3, is the service module. And so the service module is basically just there to help the astronauts, and it gives them the different kind of support functionalities that they need in order to live in space while they're traveling to the moon and back. And the service module is being created in collaboration with the European Space Agency. So we're working with engineers in Europe, in Germany, and France, and all different countries in Europe to work on building the service module. Okay. So SLS is the most powerful rocket we've ever built, and it's going to be more powerful than any of the rockets that are currently launching now or that we've launched in the past. It launches Orion up, which carries our astronauts. It can also carry cargo and science instruments. We have some really interesting and cool science experiments that are going to be launched on SLS that will help us gain a better understanding of our universe. That's really the point of space exploration in the first place, is to conduct scientific experiments and to broaden our knowledge of our world and our universe and our place in it. So SLS is going to be the backbone of our deep space human exploration, and it's going to allow us to go places we've never gone before. In the Artemis video, we talked about going back to the moon, but then the plan is that after you get to the moon, then you can go to other places in the solar system like Mars. And so it allows us this really nice kind of stepping stone approach to exploring deeper into the solar system than we've ever gone before. Okay, so careers at NASA. I'm an aerospace engineer, which is kind of just the typical NASA engineer person. There's tons of us that work at NASA, but you don't have to be an engineer or an astronaut to work at NASA. We need people who can do all different kinds of things. First of all, there are so many different types of engineers to begin with, right? You have people who do all different kinds of things. But then we also need people who work our social media, who help us with our outreach and help make the presentations like the one I'm showing today. People who are geologists and scientists who help us decide on what kind of scientific experiments we should be conducting. People have to design our spacesuits that our astronauts will use when they're in space. We need people who are experienced in robotics design to help us build landers, rovers, and all the different kind of things that help our astronauts when they're in space. We need people who are graphic artists and designers. I'm going to show a video in a couple minutes that goes through the launch process that was designed by a graphic artist. Space chef. the astronauts have to eat when they're in space. And so somebody has to help come up with what foods that they can eat and what's the most efficient way to package those foods and things like that. So there's tons of careers and things you can do at NASA that aren't just either being an astronaut or being an engineer. Okay, this is the other video. Patricia, let me stop sharing. Okay, so this is a launch animation that is going to show how the SLS launch will happen. So before we launch, we've got to do some kind of checkout things and go through, make sure everything is functioning correctly on the vehicle. We do lots of different testing, and in my bio, you heard about launch permit criteria. Those are the things that we say, okay, this has to be right, this has to be right, and this has to be right in order for us to feel like we can launch. We have to put fuel into our tanks, so we have something to help propel us into space, and get ready and just make sure that everything is good to go before we launch. We will start the countdown at 6 minutes before a launch. We'll pull back the arm. So the crew access arm basically just goes out to the vehicle and shows how that's how the astronauts get into the launch vehicle. 15 seconds or so, we start getting ready to light everything. We have something called the sound suppression water system, and that puts all this water down into the trench and helps mute the sounds of the engines. 6 seconds prior to launch, we light the engines, and then right at liftoff, our candle boosters, they light, and that's when we lift off. We have 8.8 million pounds of thrust. So as the thrust is basically like as the rocket is being pushed up, the fuel is pushing against the ground, and that's what pushes the rocket into space. Those candle boosters will burn out after about 2 minutes, and we'll throw them off, and they'll be jettisoned. We will get rid of any payload shrouds if we need, and we'll also get rid of the launch abort system. And so then about 3 minutes in, we are just the Orion capsule and the core stage going into orbit. 8 minutes in, we have used all of the fuel that we're carrying in our orange fuel tank. And so then we need to get rid of that. And so we throw that away. And so now we just have the Orion capsule and the upper stage. That upper stage burns a little bit. And then we do something called a translunar injection, which is the maneuver that's required to get us on the path to the moon. So then after we have done that translunar injection burn, we're on our way to the moon. So I think that that's kind of how SLS works and how the process happens for launch. All right, let me see what else I have left. My charts. Okay. So the last thing that I have is just my social media chart. So that is the end of my prepared presentation. If you guys want to ask questions now.
Great. I think we're going to have Emily hop on. I think she's gathering some of our questions. She's going to hop on, and looks like we have some good questions coming in from our chat. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to her. She'll be asking you some questions, Caitlin.
Great.
Yes, hello everyone. We have some great questions coming in, so give me just a moment to collect them all, and then we'll get started.
Caitlin, can you go ahead and unshare your screen for me so that way I can throw up some additional pictures during Q&A?
Oh, stop. Yes. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. No problem.
All right. Okay, let's get started with this list. So on Facebook, we have great questions coming in. The first one was from Meredith and Zoe. They want to know, how do the astronauts get food on the space station?
Well, great question, Meredith and Zoe. So we just take the food with us when we go. So every time that we launch astronauts to the space station, we also provide supplies and things that they need as a resupply. And so that includes food and equipment and whatever other kind of things that they might need. The food is actually dehydrated, which means that we suck all of the water out of it because water is actually really heavy and hard to launch into space because of how heavy it is. So we take all of the water out of the food, and then we send the dehydrated food up to the space station with the resupply missions. And then when they're ready to eat it, they use the water on space station to rehydrate the food. And then they can eat it like they normally would here on Earth.
Great. This is my personal question. Like, what kind of foods do y'all eat in space?
Well, so the astronauts actually, I think, for the most part, get to pick from a pretty wide variety of different food options. They have a menu, and so they can say, okay, I want this, 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 and this. So the astronauts get to choose. They do like things that are kind of easier to eat in space because eating in space is a little bit more difficult than it is here because the food can float away depending on what kind of food it is. So it's important that the food be packaged in a way that that the astronauts can eat it. But for the most part, the people that work with the astronauts are pretty good about trying to get whatever food the astronauts like so that they can have things that they enjoy to eat while they're in space.
Great. And just a reminder for our friends watching, you can still submit questions in the chat, and we'll try to get as many as possible to Caitlyn. So Meredith and Zoe ask, what's it feel like in space?
What does it feel like in space? Well, I haven't been to space, so I can't really give you a personal answer to what it feels like in space. But what I can tell you is that in space you feel weightless, and you aren't weightless, but you feel weightless because, and so you float around. It might feel like when you're in a swimming pool, you know, and you're swimming and you're not touching the bottom of the pool and you're kind of just floating there. I imagine that that's what it will feel like. We use swimming pools now to help our astronauts train and understand what it will be like to be in space and to feel weightless. And so I think that this is a really good video. So in this video, I think that's Kate. She is showing how her hair just floats everywhere in space. And so she has long hair, and so it's kind of just stands up on her head like that. Because it doesn't, gravity on Earth just pulls your hair down, right? But in space, it just goes wherever.
Cool. All right. Emily and Micah, who's 7 years old, wants to know which rocket will be sent into space first.
So the first thing that we will launch is we're actually going to do a couple of test launches of the crewed, the astronaut crew version of the space launch system, because we want to make sure that everything is working correctly. For the most part, the crew variety and the cargo variety are very similar. They just have kind of different things on top, but how they work and most of their basic pieces are the same. But so we send the crew version up to do some testing. We send the crew out just on their own around the moon once, where they just kind of go around the moon and then come back just to test out all of our systems and stuff before we actually send the cargo variety up when we need it. And I think right now, Twyla or somebody will have to tell me for sure, but I think that our first launch of the cargo variety isn't going to be until maybe I don't know, at least the 6th or 7th launch. So most of the first launches will be the crew variety.
Simona, who's also 7 years old, wants to know what kind of science experiments you do in space.
That's a really good question. So we determine what science experiments we're going to do. Basically, scientists come and they give proposals and they say, okay, I want to do this experiment because I think that we should understand this thing or something, you know. And so it's important, though, that the experiments that we conduct on the space station and in space, that the gravity portion be important. And so they really should be about understanding what happens to something when you have gravity versus when you do not have gravity. So water is really cool. I like this video. It's really cool in space because water has this really interesting property called surface tension. And so what that does is it makes water kind of bubble up into a bubble in space. And so there's some things like that that we can't learn on Earth because we don't have any, like, it's just a function of microgravity that allows that to happen. And so we want those experiments to be things that we can learn in space that we can't learn on Earth. But we do all kinds of different experiments. There have been experiments on plant growth and how plants grow. There have been experiments about, you know, on our astronauts, sometimes we study how their body is responding to space, and you know, we might do blood tests and things like that to just understand how the space environment affects humans. Sometimes we do different kinds of materials testing. If we want to use a new material, it's helpful to understand how that material will react to how that material will react to microgravity.
Cool. And so this is kind of a follow-up question. Do you have a personal favorite science experiment that you're going to be doing?
Do I have a personal favorite experiment? Was that the question?
Yes.
So I actually don't really know what experiments we will be conducting when we launch SLS. But what I will say is I think that the plant experiments that you guys are seeing on the screen now are really interesting, because one kind of challenge with traveling in deep space is food. One of the questions we had earlier was, how do we get the food to the astronauts? And I said, right now we just send it up in a rocket, but that's not really efficient. And we want to be able to grow food in space and kind of have that food there already. And so I think a lot of the experiments that we do regarding plant growth are really interesting because they are really applicable to how we can continue exploring in space.
Let's see, where are we? So this is a question from Karen, who is one of our educators at Think Great. Wants to know, does anyone have to go get the candle boosters out of the Atlantic Ocean after they're jettisoned?
Yeah, so during this space shuttle, when the boosters would come down, they would land in the ocean, and then we had these two tugboats that would go out and get them, and they would bring them back, and then we would refurbish them and use them again. For SLS, we aren't going to do that. We're not going to be refurbishing them, so they will just sink to the bottom of the ocean.
So this question is from Jake. Jake would like to know why the cargo boosters were advanced and the astronaut boosters were not, and that was on the slideshow.
Yeah, it's a good question, Jake. So the boosters currently are based off of this design that we've been using that we used on the space shuttle, and that booster was designed like 40 years ago, and so it's kind of old. And so the advanced boosters that you see, that's kind of how we are making improvements to those boosters and kind of just bringing them more into more relevant technology, and so they will kind of transition away from these heritage boosters that we used on shuttle towards more evolved, advanced, and kind of with newer technology on our newer evolved boosters.
Okay. And so this is, next question is from Jesse, who is our resident space expert at Thinkery. He loves space. He wants to know, okay, this is going to be a long one, but SLS has commonalities with the space shuttle hardware, such as the main booster, RS-25 engines, and the solid rocket boosters. For your team and the solid rocket boosters you work on, what are some of the differences between the SRBs from space shuttles and those that your team are working on for SLS?
This is definitely a question from someone who knows some stuff about NASA. Yes, so the solid rocket boosters that we use, the biggest thing is that the solid rocket boosters we used on the space shuttle had 4 solid rocket segments. And so there's basically 4 pieces of solid rocket that go together. So the SLS booster is 5 rocket segments instead of 4. So that's kind of the biggest thing. We've also made some kind of minor updates to the different support pieces. And what I mean by support pieces is the like avionics type things, and that aren't specifically part of the rocket itself, but help the rocket operate. So for the boosters, the biggest thing is just that it's a bigger booster. If you are curious about the other elements as well, the core stage, which is the equivalent to the external tank on the space shuttle, again, a little bit bigger. We're using the RS-25s, but this time we have 4 instead of 3 on space shuttle. They are currently using, and for the first launch, we're using RS-25 engines that we used on shuttle. So those engines have already flown before, and they flew on shuttle, and then we took them off of shuttle and we've refurbished them, cleaned them up and everything, and now we're going to use them again. And then also we are going to start building some new RS-25s that are based on the same design. And then I think they are making some RS-25 design changes and upgrades as well. And then the upper stage, which on the first flight is the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, that's new. We have not used that before, but it has actually been used on some industry rockets, like the Delta IV, I think. So that also has a little bit of experience. Does that answer the question, Jesse?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer that.
Okay. Sorry, let me just get to the next one here. Micah has another question. What part of the space shuttle do you think is the coolest?
Which of the space shuttles do I think is the coolest? Is that the question?
What part of the shuttle do you think is the coolest?
Oh, what part of the shuttle do I think is the coolest? Well, I work on the boosters, so if I don't say the boosters, I might get in trouble. But every part is cool. If we're talking about the shuttle specifically, the orbiter, which is the wing plane, is definitely the coolest. It looks the coolest. But if we're talking about SLS, I think, this is a hard question. Every part is so important. I have a hard time. I think, gosh, I keep thinking, oh, this part's the best, and then I'm like, well, yeah, but this other part's important too. I don't know. I think they're all really cool and important. Sorry, that's like a non-answer answer to the question.
Well, it is a rocket, so I feel like that's a pretty valid answer. AJ, who is our lovely moderator as well, wants to know what your favorite part of working at NASA is.
Well, man, what's my favorite part of working at NASA? Okay, my favorite part of working at NASA is just the fact that I get to work at NASA. It's so cool to think that the work that we're doing is helping us explore our universe and learn things. And I've always been so curious and had questions, and I just want to know what's out there. And it's so exciting to be able to be part of the team that's helping us learn and helping us kind of understand more than what we understand now. And it's just really cool. Like I said during my talk, after the We Go Artemis Generation video, watching that video, I work at NASA every day, and that video still gives me goosebumps. So it's just a really cool and exciting thing to be a part of.
All right. Let's see here. Harvey wants to know how many years until people live on the moon or on Mars?
Ooh, Harvey, I wish I knew the answer to that question. So let me give you the best answers that I can. The first is that we are going to send people back to the moon in 2024, so that's 4 years from now, but they won't be living on the moon just yet. So we will have to continue to work and design new habitats and things like that for them going forward. And so that's going to take, several years of additional work before we can really live on the moon, or even kind of beyond that.
Okay. Wesley wants to know, what do the astronauts do with their trash in space?
They throw it away, just like we do here. So we basically collect all the trash that the astronauts don't need, and then we put that trash back in a capsule, and then it burns up on re-entry. And so when it's coming back to Earth, it just kind of burns up. And so that's how we get rid of most of the trash that the space station astronauts produce. Some things can be recycled and reused. We have one really cool experiment on space station right now called Made in Space. And Made in Space is this, it's a 3D printer that can be used in space to print things that the astronauts need, like tools and things. So one kind of topic of conversation that I've heard kind of around that is that we might be able to use some of the trash and like packaging especially to create 3D printing filament material that can then be used and reused to print new tools and things. But that's kind of still off in the future a little bit.
So this is another question from Karen, who is one of our educators at Thinkery. This is for Caitlyn and Patricia, if you want to answer. If you had the chance, would you ever go to the moon or Mars?
I would. I think I definitely am like a little bit nervous about the launch aspect of it, but I would definitely go to the moon or Mars if I was given the opportunity.
Cool. So this is another question from Simona, who is 7. She wants to know, how do you go to the bathroom in space?
So the bathroom in space is actually really interesting from an engineering perspective. There is basically, it's like a vacuum. And so the toilet, you sit down on the toilet and the hole has this vacuum pump. And so it just sucks the waste away from you. That's like the best answer I can give. Oh, so Patricia's got a video. Okay, so there are funnels, which I'm kind of hoping she'll show in the video. Oh, she's showing how you brush your teeth.
I might have to find a different one. I thought this one would work, but she's talking about other things. Stand by.
Well, okay. So what she's talking about there in that one, just while she's pulling it up, was she was talking about, she had fingernail clippers, and so she was talking about what did they do about things like the pieces of your fingernail or dead skin cells that come off. And so all that stuff gets sucked into the air system on the space station, and they have filters. And then the filters trap those particles and things and prevent them from getting put back into the air. Okay, so so what we're seeing here is there's the toilet. So the toilet has a seat, and then it also has a tube. You can also see that so the tube function is for liquid waste, and then you would have the seat function for solid waste. The seat also has, I saw it in a different clip there, these footrests. So if you have to use the seat function, the foot restraints can kind of help you, because you're in space, right? And you don't want to like float off the toilet. So the foot restraints help hold you down to the toilet. Let's see what else is in the video. Oh yeah, so he's showing there, he was holding the funnels for liquid waste. Yep, those are the funnels. So that's kind of how it works.
Cool. Okay. This question is from Rob. He wants to know, how do you grow plants in space?
So the way you grow plants in space is about the same as how you grow them here. Plants still grow in space just like they would on Earth, but they kind of behave a little bit differently in space. So, you know, for example, the root structure here on Earth, our root structure kind of goes straight down for a plant. But so without that gravity, the roots kind of don't have quite the same directionality being down to them. So there's some kind of minor differences in the way that plants behave, but they still grow just like they would here on Earth.
Ooh.
I think the plant experiments are really neat. Oh, so this video right here is showing we actually grew some lettuce, and so that's the first time that the astronauts had ever eaten plants that they grew themselves on space station.
Great. Okay. Adam wants to know, how many days does it take to launch a rocket?
How many days does it take to launch a rocket?
Yes.
Well, I guess it depends on what you consider launching the rocket. If you mean how long does it take from when we say liftoff to when we're in orbit, that's only 1 day. It takes 8 minutes. But if you mean, what about, you know, from when the rocket rolls out to the launch pad to when it launches, that could be, you know, a month or a couple of weeks. And so it kind of depends on what time frame you're looking at. But the easiest answer is it takes 8 minutes to get to space. But then there are months and weeks and years of work that are required just to get to the place where we can launch.
Cool. And this is a question about plants again, but Wesley wanted to know, how do the plants get sunlight?
So they get artificial light. They don't have sunlight per se, but we have light bulbs that provide them artificial UV light. Perfect. So in the screen you can kind of see it's kind of pink. So that's from the ultraviolet light bulbs that are used to provide the plants with the same kind of light that they would get from the sun.
All right. And then Nora, who's 5 years old, wants to know how long it'll take to get to the moon.
So once we get into space, the time it takes to get to the moon is 3 days. So it's like if you were driving your car for 3 days straight, that's how long it would take to get to the moon.
Cool. This is my question. Have they picked who's going to the moon yet?
I don't know. I kind of think they have, but I don't know if, like they've said for sure, and maybe Patricia might know. I have a name in my head, but I don't know if I want to I don't want to be wrong. So Patricia, do you know the
Sure.
answer?
So there's a pool of astronauts that are eligible to go to the moon, but they haven't announced the name of the crew yet. So what I've heard, I work at Johnson where the astronaut office is, and they usually name the crew a year out, a year and a half at the most, because they don't want to experience training fatigue. And so like the longer you train and the longer you're waiting to go into space, there's some psychological kind of things that go along with that. So they want to announce and then give the crew a year and a half to train and then launch. And so we should know soon. I mean, the first mission for Artemis 2, which is the first crewed mission, it's only a couple of years away. So hopefully within the next year, we'll have an announcement.
So we have about enough time for 2 more questions. So we have one more viewer question, and then we'll have one that I think is a good way to close us out. But Simona wants to know, since you float in space, do you also float in the spaceship, or is it just on the moon?
You're muted, Caitlin.
Gosh, thank you. So as soon as you float in the spaceship, so as soon as you get into orbit around the Earth, you will start floating inside the spaceship. Now, astronauts might be strapped down to their chairs, so in that case, they wouldn't float. But once they aren't strapped down to anything, then they would start floating as soon as they're in space. And they do that on the space station and in their capsule. On the moon, you don't float per se, because the moon actually does have some gravity, and so you can walk on the moon. The moon has 1/6 of the Earth's gravity, and so when you walk on the moon, it's kind of like jumping, because the moon doesn't like pull you down to it quite as hard as the Earth does. So you do still have a little bit of gravity on the moon that helps you walk a little.
Okay, and our last question. So if anyone watching, or even the staff at Thinkery, is interested in rockets in space, what are some fun things that we can do after this webinar to kind of keep it going?
There are tons of activities on the NASA website, so maybe Patricia might be able to show some of where that is. But obviously you can do all of your own research and read books from the library and things like that. But there are other activities you can do, like if you're specifically interested in rockets, you can build and launch model rockets. Those kind of things you can actually buy just like at the store or online. You may not be able to buy all the pieces online, but and then of course we have this NASA website. You can go to nasa.gov, and then I think there's a way you can get to like a kids section that has lots of different kids club, and then you can get lots of different activities, and there's things like from coloring pages to like there's a maze to kind of more advanced type of things, and so there's a wide variety of different things you can do on the NASA website.
And I added that link that y'all provided to the chat for everyone watching. But I just want to thank everyone so much for your great questions and joining us. And I'll hand it over to AJ.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Caitlin, for sharing all of that information. I feel like I learned so much, and now have a million more space questions. So it'll keep me kind of, I'll have to keep researching on the Artemis team and kind of what y'all are up to, but we're just so grateful.
Thank you guys for having me.
Yes, yeah, we're so grateful to have you guys, and for y'all to be our first installment of our webinar series. Thank you guys so much, everyone who joined us and asked so many great questions. We really appreciate those. And we hope you'll join us for our next webinar, our next installment of our series. Our next one's gonna be, I'll give a little hint, our next one's gonna be more for parents and providing them with some great information than for the kiddos, but it'll still be fun, and it'll still provide some great information. So we'll definitely be sharing that out very soon. And Thank you, everyone, and I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. We'll talk to you soon.